I feel like often we think that as adults, we have progressed way beyond the ways we interacted with each other as kids. But when it comes right down to it, I think the ways we interact socially as adults can be categorized perhaps in the same 4 categories as the kinds of kids you find at a playground. Now, think back to when you were a kid, or maybe think to right now when you're an adult and you also act this way. Were you the one who plays happily by yourself at the playground? Or maybe the one who plays by yourself because you're too nervous to try playing with the other kids? Do you see yourself in either of those? Or were you the one who kind of waits around on the sidelines to see if another kid asks you to play with them? Or maybe some of you, actually I'm pretty sure some of you here, were that really brave one who actually approaches the other kid, right? And asks them to play with you. Now when I was a kid, I was never the last one, pretty much. I would kind of wait and hope that maybe someone would ask me to play. And if that didn't happen, or if it started getting a little too awkward to wait and hope, I would just go to the swings, because that's an easy thing to do on your own, right? No one thinks you're weird if you're swinging on the swings alone. The idea of approaching another kid and asking them to play with me felt terrifying. After all, if I asked, that gave them the opportunity to say no. I avoided rejection by avoiding extending the invitation altogether. You can probably see the problem here. What that meant for me as a kid is that I was often lonely. It wasn't that I didn't have any friends, but I was never quite as connected as I wanted to be. And that feeling has persisted for me into much of my adulthood. That sense of wishing for a little more connection. And it turns out I'm not alone. I have been fascinated by the research done by Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy into what he calls the loneliness epidemic in the United States. Dr. Murthy began talking about this back in 2017, after he went on a listening tour all around the country. What he noticed is that no matter what he was talking to people about, the conversation somehow came back to loneliness. The data at that point was already clear that loneliness was a problem. 20% of adults in 2017 said that they struggled with loneliness, and that was just the number who was willing to admit it. Now, in 2023, 6 years and a global pandemic later, that number has more than doubled. Dr. Murthy says that in 2023, about 50%, or more than 1 in every 2 Americans, is experiencing a measurable level of loneliness. And while you might wonder, what the heck is our Surgeon General doing, spending his time on loneliness rather than real health problems, it turns out that the long-term effects of loneliness are nearly as bad for your health as the long-term effects of smoking. In a New York Times piece the last spring, Dr. Murthy wrote, "Loneliness is more than just a bad feeling. When people are socially disconnected, the risk of anxiety and depression increases. So does their risk of heart disease, dementia, and stroke. The increased risk of premature death associated with social disconnection is comparable to smoking daily." Isn't that amazing? And it's not just health, but societal issues at stake as well. Dr. Murthy goes on to say in that article, loneliness and isolation hurt whole communities. Social disconnection is associated with reduced productivity in the workplace, worse performance in school, and diminished civic engagement. When we are less invested in one another, we are more susceptible to polarization and less able to pull together to face the challenges that we cannot solve alone. from climate change and gun violence to economic inequality and future pandemics. As it has built for decades, the epidemic of loneliness and isolation has fueled other problems that are killing us and threatening to rip our country apart. Now, all of that sounds pretty dire, right? But the good news for those of us here in this room and joining on Zoom is that we are currently engaging in one of the activities that Dr. Murthy, the Surgeon General, tells us is an antidote to the loneliness epidemic, being part of a religious community. So that's great for us, right? But at the same time as that problem of loneliness has been on the rise, participation in religious communities has been declining. Now, there are some people that will say this is because young people don't want to be part of religious communities. But the research on loneliness tells us a very different story. Dr. Murthy's research has shown that a longing to be in community with others, to have that sense of belonging, exists among all generations. Many people just don't know where to find it. And in 2023, church or religious community is no longer the obvious answer it once was. Now, what this says to me is that we need to be a lot more intentional about being invitational. There is this urge in all of us, this desire to be welcomed, to be invited in, to be wanted in a space. And yet we rarely translate that desire into the ideas that we ourselves should be the inviter or the welcomer, especially when it comes to inviting people to church. We are, more often than not, one of those first 3 kids on the playground, settling for playing alone or waiting for someone else to ask. Or maybe if we're just a little braver, playing like next to someone and waiting to see if they bring up the idea of playing together. In Unitarian Universalism especially, there is this deep reluctance to invite people into our faith communities. I even feel it myself. Sometimes I'm like, I shouldn't even tell people I'm a minister because they'll think I'm evangelizing, right? And that's what we think. We think, am I gonna seem like I'm evangelizing? Am I going to come off as pushing my beliefs on other people? That is, after all, not what we do as Unitarian Universalists. We value the diversity of beliefs in our world, and we offer people the freedom to choose. But what I think we often miss in this is that people can only choose something that they actually know about. They can only choose to say no to something that they've been invited into. And they can also only choose to say yes then. Being invitational is, in fact, giving people that choice that we so value. A choice that maybe they didn't feel like they had before we extended that invitation. Or a choice that they didn't even know was possible. I can't tell you how many times people have said to me when they join the congregation as new members, I wish I had known about Unitarian Universalism sooner. And you know what no one has ever said to me? I'm glad I didn't know about Unitarian Universalism until now. I'm so glad that I had to seek this out on my own. I'm glad I had to work so hard to find this community. That was great. No one has ever said that. We've got this amazing antidote to loneliness right here among us. And the truth is, we're not very good at sharing it. The idea of inviting someone to church feels scary and hard and uncomfortable. I get it. Like I said, I was not the kid who invited other kids to play with me. But it also feels important, especially in this moment. Our work as Unitarian Universalists is to create a world where everyone knows that they are worthy, that they are loved. To create a world that is full of the opposite of loneliness. And I wonder if some of that begins with that vulnerable task of reaching out, of inviting people in. As we were talking about welcome in our Worship Associates meeting last month, one of the ideas that emerged was about the way that welcoming a new person into a community really solidifies your own relationship with that community. The gift of welcoming a newcomer actually goes two ways. They feel welcomed, and you feel like you are more deeply a part of the community. It strikes me as similar to the idea of a housewarming, when you invite people into a space to make it more truly yours. By welcoming others into community, you get to take ownership of it in a new way. This has certainly been my experience when joining communities, that I am more invested when I become a part of creating that community for someone else. When I first moved to the East Coast, I lived in Washington, D.C. for a brief time doing an internship. While I was there, I tried to get involved in the Unitarian Universalist Church and the young adult group, but it never quite clicked. Maybe it was something about the group, but I think it's more likely it was because I knew I was only going to be there for a short time, and so I didn't invest that much in it. But when I moved to Boston, it was a different story. I wanted to settle in. I wanted to belong somewhere. So I found a UU church, and I joined the young adult group, and I jumped in with 2 feet. By which I mean, in this context, that I volunteered to lead worship the next time around, the very first time that I attended a young adult group meeting. They should have known right then that I was going to be a minister. Not only that, but I volunteered to lead worship with another member of the group who was not even there that evening. The first time I met her was to plan the worship. It was the exact opposite of my typical kid on the playground behavior, and I'm not going to try to say that I wasn't nervous going to meet this mystery person with whom I was supposed to plan worship, but it worked. By the second time I attended, it was me as the worship leader who was welcoming in newcomers. It solidified my place in the group, connected me quickly to those who were already there. They became my people very fast. It is this co-creation of community that I believe we are all called to as Unitarian Universalists. We don't just get to sit back and feel lucky that we've found this great antidote to loneliness. Rather, our job then is to share it with others, to say, "Come, you belong with me. We'll shelter and share bread together. We belong." And we are called to do this not just for people who happen to find their way in our doors, but to reach out and invite people in, to take that vulnerable step of bringing it up, even if it doesn't quite fit into the conversation. So in that spirit, I have a challenge for you this week. Next week, we are having a Bring a Friend Sunday, something we haven't done in a long time. Meaning that we are encouraging all of you to invite a friend to come to church with you. So my challenge is, can you have at least one conversation this week with someone about our church? Maybe for some of you, it'll be the very first time you admit that you're going to church. That's okay. Baby steps. Can you share with someone something you love about coming here? And can you offer an invitation to join in? I know it may feel really scary, but inviting people into a community you love that has value in your life is a gift for both the person you invite and for yourself. It is giving that person the choice to try out our community for themselves. And it's giving you the investment in this place and these people, the opportunity to claim this church as your own. Come, you belong with me. We'll shelter and share bread together. Come, let us create the opposite of loneliness for one another and for those we have yet to meet. May it be so.